And it says you are live. Welcome everyone. I am at home. And yes, I do have on a robe because I am at home.
The new business casual.
That's what you keep saying. And the new
Exactly.
business, come as you are.
Anything goes.
Anything goes. I'm really excited because we launched the Motor City Woman TV streaming platform a couple weeks ago, and it was all about creating content that people can watch in addition to listening. So, of course, over the years, we've specialized in podcasts, audiobooks, and in audio content, but we were starting to see a lot of our clients launch into YouTube channels. And what better way to have media representation than to create it yourself? And so that's what the Motor City Woman TV kind of outsource or outbrand of the studio is all about. And today I'm excited because we're kicking off one of our inaugural programs, Learning Sessions. Learning Sessions is all about matching up people who want to learn the tools, the tips, the tricks, the resources with people who have been there, done that, no filter, straight to the chaser. And that's what this show is all about. So today we have our very first guest, Anne Doyle. Yay!
Woohoo! Happy to be here.
Well, Anne, I first met you. This is my son right here. I first met you years ago when I was still working full time, and you were the keynote speaker at an event, and I got one of your books. And so that was the first time.
Oh my gosh. I don't know if I know that because my first memory was when you and I were on a panel together.
Oh no, there are many years, and I'll have to look to see if I have that first book.
First edition.
The
Powering
first
Up.
edition. And I want to say, were we at Motor City Casino, the soundboard? I'm not sure, or we were at Suburban Collection. But that was the first time, and
wow.
I was like, oh, this is amazing. And then when I had the opportunity to sit on the panel with you about women in media, I saw that as a sign, like, this is cool, because I first met you when I was in a totally different part of my career.
Wow.
And now to meet you again, and then to witness you interviewing people in the studio and the flow and everything. And I just thought that you would be the perfect person to be one of our guests on these learning sessions. Because that's one of the top questions I get from people is, if I'm interviewing someone, what happens if I get stuck? What should I ask them? How do I find them? And what better person to share your knowledge than you, a veteran broadcaster and someone who probably has interviewed, I would say, hundreds of people, thousands of people.
Oh yeah, thousands.
Thousands of people.
Oh yeah. Well, it's 5 decades, and wow. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I'm proud of it. Yeah, 5 decades for sure. And that time that we were on the panel together, I mean, I'm the one who basically said, whoa, she's doing podcasts. I want to talk to this woman after this panel is over. And so, I'm the one who approached you and said, hey, tell me about what you're doing in this whole Motor City Woman studio, because I was right at that point, just discovering really podcasting. And it was my son, of course, my 28-year-old son, who had said, Mom, you really ought to think about doing a podcast, because at that time I was thinking about writing another book. And it was my millennial son who said, nah, forget about, I know what it took for you to write that first one. You ought to be right, do a podcast, which was natural for me, because it's really just another example of using the broadcast and the reporting and the interviewing skills that I had been using for decades in my career.
Yeah, I call it on-demand talk radio, basically. When people want to make it so complicated, it really isn't.
There you go.
Yeah, that's how I like it.
On-demand talk radio. Right.
On-demand talk radio. And like I said, I've witnessed you and listened, of course, to all of your episodes, and whether it be, content that is deep or content that is light, I think that, well, I know that you have a very distinct skill of allowing a guest to go out on a tangent, but then being able to bring them back. That's the hard part. That's the hard part, because you don't want to be disrespectful.
Right. Right. That's really interesting to me, because some of it, I've probably been doing it so long that I don't even think about it. But for me to sort of back up and, take it apart into little different pieces of it, and what is it that people would like to know, and what can I share with them about how you do that? And your point about not being disrespectful, but also being in charge of the conversation is really important, because, the listeners are really counting on you to not let an interviewer hold them hostage. And and if you've ever been, listening to a speech, or you've been sitting somewhere and there's a panel discussion and there's a moderator sitting up there, and one panelist tends to do too much talking, I get mad at the moderator.
Yeah.
Because, I'm saying that person's job is to balance that. And, and sometimes, it often happens. And the other side of that, of course, is to bring out a guest who may not be that comfortable and might freeze up a little bit. So there's two pieces to that.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of my first questions for you is, how do you know, do you pick a topic first and then match that with a guest? Or do you think of a guest like, oh my gosh, I really want to talk to this person, and then think of, okay, what topic or what theme can I slide them into?
It's both. It's definitely both. Sometimes you meet somebody, or you read about somebody, or you hear about someone, and you say, wow, that person would be perfect for my podcast. I want to talk to them. Other times it's about a hot topic or an issue that you think is really important. And then, doing the research and going and finding people who, could have a really interesting conversation about that. And sometimes, I think in the podcast, one of the things that I've seen is that, sometimes to have two guests, not just one, and mix it up a little bit. So that it makes it more interesting, that you have people with different perspectives, or it's like a complex issue, and it's like an elephant. One person sees the tail, another person sees the head, another person sees the trunk. And so I would suggest that too. But it's both. It's absolutely both.
Now, okay, so you said that it can be both. So knowing, of course, the theme of your podcast, knowing a roundabout of what you want to talk about is important. Because one of the things that I see, especially from people who are just getting into this industry of navigating the conversation, is not having an end goal. Okay, this is someone I want to talk to. It can't just be a chat.
Yeah. Right.
You have an end goal. What am I trying to get out? What point am I trying to make?
And it's really funny. I think there's all different kind of podcasts out there, and there's all different kind of audiences. And my son, he sent me the podcast that he listens to when I first started out, and he said, you're going to hate all of these, but just listen, in terms of different possibilities. Right. It's like, I couldn't stand any of them. Some of it was just, guys being crazy, or that kind of humor. And then there are podcasts where people just sit around and chat. And I'm not interested in doing a podcast like that. And I'm not interested in listening to a podcast about that. But so I think that the first thing is to understand really who you are, what your focus is, and what your podcast focus is. And for example, my podcast, when I was thinking about it, and mine is called Powering Up. But the description of that podcast, and you need to be able to say in one sentence, what's your podcast about?
Yeah.
And so my podcast is, I call it a cross-generational, cross-cultural conversation about leadership, power, and gender. And that's what my podcast is about. And so anytime somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, I'd like to be on your podcast," or when I'm thinking about something that's interesting, I mean, you immediately hold it up against that and said, is this aligned with the kind of conversations and the kind of information that I'm trying to bring to my audience? And if it's not, it's like, sorry, that's interesting, but it's not where I'm going with this podcast.
Right. And you know what your audience has come to expect. So if you go too far left, they're like, well, why are we talking about this?
Right. I mean, they have to kind of trust you that when they check out an episode, that there's a certain amount of trust that you build up, that they understand maybe where you're coming from and the kind of content that they can expect.
So how do you find your guests typically?
Well, I find them two ways. I mean, one is that in my core, I am a journalist, and so that's how I move through the world. I mean, that's the lens that I bring to the world. So I'm always looking for the story. I'm always sort of my antenna are up all the time about what's new, what's important, what are people talking about, what are issues, and looking for people who I think are interesting voices, who have something significant to say. So I'm looking for them all the time. And I have a list, and as you know, I think I have 6 or 7 in the can right now that I still need to edit and get out there. And I have a long list of hot topics that I'd like to get to. So to me, it's really timely. I mean, interesting people, but always like sometimes looking for them, searching for them, other times just really being open to them. So sometimes you just meet somebody and say, wow, you would be really good. But the other part of that to me is that, someone can be an expert but they might not necessarily be a good podcast guest.
Yes. I'm so glad you brought that up, because of course I listen to podcasts all the time. And when I'm reading like the promo for an episode, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to hear from this person. And then I get to listening and I say, I can't listen to this.
You're disappointed. I mean, maybe their voice drives you crazy, or maybe it's their style of speaking, or they're boring, or whatever it is. I mean, yeah, it's not just the topic and it's not just their credentials. It's, and one of the things, we learned this, Robin, from I also host that IWF, the Game Changers podcast of the International Women's Forum. And, they're saying, okay, Anne, we want you to interview so-and-so. And all these people have incredible credentials.
Yes.
But one of the things I learned pretty quickly was, whoa, I have got to talk to these people a week ahead of time on the phone, so I can tell whether this person's going to be a good guest or not, and also that I can kind of warm them up and guide them in terms of how they can do it. Yes. And that's another thing that I would really encourage people to do is, a lot of people have never done podcasts, or they've never been interviewed, or they've never been on the radio, or they've never been on TV, or they're uncomfortable with this whole thing. And so our job as the podcasters is to, get them comfortable and bring out the best in them. And the first way to do that is to get them real comfortable and feeling natural. And, there's no gotcha questions here, unless that's your style of podcast. But if you're trying to have your guests say some really interesting things, then your job is to bring out the best in them. And I would really recommend that people talk to them ahead of time and by phone, because by phone in some ways is a better way to simulate almost a podcast kind of an interview. And give them a sense of, ask them questions and give them a sense of what you want to talk about, and ask them what they want to talk about. What's in it for them? Right.
Well, and that was one of the things I was going to bring up. A lot of people, when you're hosting a podcast, you'll send your guests like, okay, this is an overview of what the podcast is all about. This is what we're going to talk about. But you're saying to go one step further than that and schedule a phone call so that you can maybe listen to the cadence of their voice. You can, make sure that, I'll give you an example. I remember you were conducting an interview.
Uh-huh.
And this particular guest just had a slower cadence to her voice. And so you didn't want to ask a question and then immediately try to fill that time, that silence, because she was about to answer it.
Yeah.
So there were times where you just had to sit and, and
I remember I remember exactly. It was a very different culture from a different culture. Yeah. Slower style of speaking. Right. Yes. Right. Yeah.
So in something like that, you won't know that unless you build that rapport.
And that was one of the reasons why with that IWF that I said, I got to talk to these people ahead of time. So I can't just talk to them for 10 minutes before we start recording.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about, how you find people, essentially your experience, background, networking. But in addition to that, we've also talked about the prep part, scheduling a phone call to make sure that they're aligned with what your guests can expect from you, what they've come to expect from listening to your podcast, that there's no gotcha, no one's getting trapped, that, trying to set up like a win-win situation so that of course the guest is comfortable. You don't want them to, give you one word answers. Okay.
Right. Exactly.
And so that brings me to like when you're actually in the interview, and let's say you're interviewing someone and they're giving you one word answers or maybe 3-word answers. How do you like pull that out? And I've seen you do it, but I really want the audience to hear.
Have you seen me do it?
I have seen you, kind of circle back. Well, tell me more, just things like that to get them going.
Yeah. And that's an example of why, number one, if possible, you don't want to get in a situation where you have a guest that you're like, oh boy, man, this is not going well here, because then you're just trying to salvage it. And,
right.
And so, ideally, I mean, what you want to do, that's why you want to have that phone call in advance as sort of a preparatory, exploratory conversation about whether this would be a great topic and guest for your podcast. But once you're in trouble like that, that's why I say that it's that person is uncomfortable. And so I really see it as my responsibility to draw them out and to encourage them. And that has to be, for one thing, I think if someone's pace is very slow, you need to slow down too.
Right.
Because if you're talking a lot faster, it's like walking down the street together and you're up ahead of them and they're behind you, well, then just slow down your pace a little bit and maybe fix it in the editing room if you can. But I would say that a big piece of it to me also is listening to people, because sometimes, people have a whole idea of all these different questions they want to ask, and they're so intent on asking the next question that they miss the follow-up. That is really maybe the most interesting thing that person said. And that whole feeling that you get, Robin, when maybe you're listening to an interview on the radio or on a podcast, and when the interviewer asks exactly what you were wondering, and you say, yeah, that's what I wanted. And that's the interviewer listening, just as the audience is listening.
Right. I call it the Terry Gross effect.
There you go. Yeah. Great fresh air. Terry Gross
where
interviewer.
You just feel like it's such a free-flowing conversation, but if you're in that industry, that it takes a ton of preparation for it to sound so free-flowing, if that makes sense.
Perfect, because and as long as Terry Gross has been doing that show and interviewing, and she's really recognized as one of the state of the art, the gold standard of interviewing these days in terms of that style of interviewing. I think you would be shocked if you saw how much prepreration Terry Gross does.
I'm sure.
To be ready for that. She is not just walking into that
like
studio
she's read the book. And I was like, what did you have time to read the book? She's listened to the album.
That's exactly right. And she's done a ton of research about who this person is to ask questions, especially, because she's interviewing very, very famous people. But you can do it with people who aren't that famous either. I mean, there's nothing that people like more than someone asking something about them that everybody else hasn't asked, and that clearly someone did their research and asked them some questions that really showed that, hey, I know about you. I've learned about you. And here's some really intriguing things that we want to know more about.
Right. And I just saw a comment from Rocky, who's the host of Rocky's Reality. And she said, research. Do we have
time for me to tell one of my favorite stories about
Please
that?
Do. Sure, yeah.
Okay. I don't know how many in the audience are old enough to remember, but if you're a big sports fan, you'll definitely remember. But one of my favorite examples of this is about one of the all-time greatest baseball players ever, Reggie Jackson. And Reggie Jackson, of course, is in the Major League Hall of Fame. He was a great, great Detroit or a New York Yankee. Used to call him Mr. October because of so many World Series that he won. And during my career, I was covering sports in the late 70s, early 80s when Reggie Jackson was at the height of his career. And I was just a rookie TV sports reporter in Detroit and working at CBS Detroit. And the other men in that sports department did not want me there. And so when one of the tests that they gave me was when the New York Yankees came to town. Of course, everybody wants to interview Reggie Jackson.
Right.
And so they said, hey, Anne, go on down to the game tonight and get an interview with Reggie Jackson. And you can imagine somebody who is the superstar of the sports world at that time. Every single town that he went in, everybody wanted to talk to him. And so I knew I was in trouble. But how am I ever going to get an interview with Reggie Jackson? And I did my research. And so I had a plan. And when I went down to Tiger Stadium that afternoon, and the opportunity for reporters to talk to the players casually, informally, is during batting practice before the game begins.
Okay.
And, so you can go out onto the field. If you're a credentialed reporter, you can go out onto the field and you can approach the players while they're taking batting practice. They don't have to talk to you, but you can approach them and try. And so I walked out there, and there's Reggie Jackson, standing there by the batting cage, watching another guy taking, batting practice. And there are other male reporters. It was all male reporters, of course, standing around. Nobody's approaching Reggie Jackson. You don't even approach him.
Okay.
And so, I kind of took a big gulp and I walked up to him. And, he was looking, I was on his side, so he wasn't looking at me. He was watching the guy hitting the balls. And, I walked up to him and said, hello, Reggie. I'm Anne Doyle. Can I talk to you for a minute? I'm from CBS Detroit. And I know that the other reporters standing around were like, oh, this is going to be great. Oh, watch what he does to this little punk girl who doesn't belong here. And of course, Reggie Jackson didn't even look at me. Wow. He just completely ignored me. And so I said to him, Señor Jackson, me llamo Anne Doyle. Me gustaría hablar con usted en español. And he turned and he looked at me. And then I said, conozco que usted habla español y me gustaría hablar sobre los jugadores latinos. And what I said to him was, I know that you speak Spanish. And would you talk to me in Spanish about the Latin players coming into the game? And he turned to me and he said, "No problema, señorita, que quiere conocer?" Which is no problem, señorita. What do you want to know?
Wow.
And we did. And these other guys are like, what the hell just happened? What just happened was I did my research to figure out, how can I get this man to talk to me? What's in it for him? What was in it for him was he had a chance to show that he spoke Spanish. And it was something he cared about, because he was helping the Latin players come into Major League Baseball at that time.
Wow.
And it was a question he really never got asked.
So maybe it's coming from a different angle as well, not just looking at the surface of, okay, this is the book, this is the theme of the book, but what prompted you to write this book? What do you want people to get out of reading this book? So just digging a little deeper.
There you go. There you go.
And I see a comment from Darlene, really enjoying insights and interaction. Thanks for the invite, Anne.
Hey there, Darlene. Hi. Thanks for tuning in. I sent it to some of my friends in Spain too. You know, I write to my global network. I have about 5,000 in my global network of, you know, friends and people that I've met over the years who said, yes, you can add me to your global network. And you know, I usually write about every month or every 6 weeks. And I sent it out, you know, that we were going to be doing this evening. And I had people from Spain saying, well, it's 1 o'clock in the morning, Anne, but we'd like to participate. But is this going to be recorded?
Yes.
Okay. They asked me that so that they could listen to this later and I can share it with my network.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. So I remember was this one of your first shows, or may have been your first show, the show that was in remembrance of Miss Franklin.
Aretha Franklin. It was the first show.
It was the first show. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was when you're crafting your show outline. Okay. So you have a guest, you have them prepped. When I remember working with you and looking over the outline that you had, I hadn't seen anything like it before.
Oh.
And I actually use, when it comes to editing, especially, I use the kind of the template that you use for your edits with other clients when they're looking for editing.
Oh, but really? I didn't know that.
I do, because I think what's interesting is where you will have, okay, this is what I want to talk about, and you may have a question down there, or maybe a couple of questions, but it appears that you're waiting. You want to see, again, what we talked about earlier. You want to see where the conversation goes. Because that was about that's probably a 4-page. I just remember you having 4 pages of, was that the edit where we put all those different pieces together?
Well, yeah. And that's, the example of lots of different ways to do the podcast. And, you know, you have encouraged me to do this too, Robin. I mean, sometimes, I haven't taken my podcast out onto remote locations yet, but that's another thing to do that adds some interest to it. And then there's the whole, you know, in the studio or virtually doing an interview where people are sitting around and talking. And then with the Aretha Franklin podcast which we launched Powering Up, it was really almost like going out and going back to my roots of being a TV news street reporter, and, you know, going out and interviewing a lot of people who were standing in line, you know, waiting to show respect to Aretha Franklin at the Charles Wright Museum of African American History. And, you know, I did a whole lot of interviews and then going back and listening to those and then putting together a story that used all those different little sound bites, interesting sound bites in there. So that's why that was 4 pages long, because there were, you know, there was the sound bite and then there was what we would call a track or my recorded voice in between, you know, putting together the whole story. So that was what that was. But normally when I'm doing just in the studio or just have a couple of guests, I still have a script. I mean, and it's an open and a close in terms of here's how we're going to open this program. Here's how we're going to introduce these people, because you have to introduce them well and not just wing it, but show some respect to them. And I often ask people to send me two or three sentences about how you want me to introduce you. And, don't give me a paragraph. I'm not going to use all that. Right. Don't send me your resume because I'm not using all that. And, give me 2 sentences about how you want to be introduced. And, and the same thing in terms of the close. I mean, how are you going to wrap this thing up? And then in the middle is you can take that conversation wherever you want to go, but have a plan about where you really want to go.
Okay, so you said have a plan. Does that mean that when you're, you have a guest, you secured a guest for a reason, do you already have a sense in your head of how you want the conversation to go and how, what you want to end on, or do you kind of leave that up to the conversation itself?
Well, I usually have an idea. I mean, clearly, if I'm inviting somebody to be on my podcast, I have an idea of why I think they would be an interesting guest. And so, yeah. But also, it's up to me to find out, from them, what do they want to make sure they get a chance to say. And that's often a really good way to just wrap up a conversation is to basically say, hey, is there anything, one last word that you want to get in here? Is there anything we didn't cover that you really wanted to have a chance to say? That's a real easy one.
So creating that win-win.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely. Yeah.
One thing I'm noticing, as podcasting is continuously evolving, now I'm starting to see agencies that represent individuals to pitch them to podcasts.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a whole different industry that's coming up. So I thought it was really interesting.
Well, it's the same industry. It's just public relations. I mean, people have been doing PR and pitching people to magazines and newspapers and radio stations and TV stations and for movies. I mean, it's your agent, your PR person, your agent. And now they're just now they realize the podcast audiences are big enough that and so I'm actually starting to get strangers contacting me, and I'm like,
are you starting to get pitches?
Yeah, and so that's a good thing.
That is a great thing.
When you're starting to get pitches from strangers in California who want their person to be on your podcast, they're like, oh, that's pretty good. How did you hear about Powering Up?
And that's the first question is, well, how did you hear about it?
Exactly. How did you hear about that? And I mean, sometimes it's in like LinkedIn. I get tons of LinkedIn people who do podcasts who want to be friends and everything, and so I don't really know them or anything, but that I mean, that's all good. And if they have something interesting, then I'm happy to feature them.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've walked through identifying guests, prepping guests, being in the moment of conducting the interview, and making sure that you stick to a script but leave some space for conversation and to maybe finding out something new about the guest. But one of the things that, and I think we touched on this before we went live, how do you handle guests that go off topic? I guess it's just having a bad day and they're just trying to phone it in. And how do you manage that?
Well, there's a number of ways. I mean, if they're really just phoning it in, I mean, I don't do my podcast live. And so my podcasts are all taped and then I edit them to tighten them up and and so I can always just drop it. And I mean, they're just phoning it in. I mean, it just never gets out there. It's like, thank you very much. Something went technically wrong with that. I don't know ever what happened to that. It just never gets released. But the other piece of that is, I mean, I think that podcasts are much more informal.
Yeah.
They're much more informal than a TV or live radio in a lot of ways. And I really encourage that in my guests. And there's two pieces to answering your question. In terms of encouraging that, sometimes when I'm talking with, some people with some very big jobs and big credentials, I mean, they're careful with what they say. And they'll say something like, well, I don't want to be political, or I don't want to. And I said, no. Here you can be political. Yeah. Tell me more about that. Encourage them, like give them the free space to say what they really, really mean, instead of having to hold back and be careful. I don't want people to be careful on my podcast. I mean, I want them, if there's someone that I respect, then I want them to tell the truth. Hey, and if someone is going off on a tangent, you're just like, whoa, okay, let's get that. I mean, don't be shy about it.
So, like, I love to learn more about that.
But afterwards, in the meantime, or wow, there's so much to talk about. Or, I want to bring, Robin in on this conversation here. I mean, don't hesitate to cut him off. I mean, you can laugh about it.
Right.
You can laugh about it. I mean, you're not rude. I mean, it's a conversation. I mean, how would you handle that if you were in a conversation with people? You would basically say, okay, hey, that's enough about that. Let's get into this other piece that we want to make sure we get a chance to talk about, or anything like that. But I would just say, you're in charge. You're in charge. And if you start getting a little sense like that's enough, then that's enough.
And you can tell that. I mean, just body language will tell you, where they're just looking at you like, okay, that's enough.
That's and you develop that gut yourself, and you have to listen to that, and react quickly. I mean, that's what's going to keep your podcast interesting,
right?
But I would, I mean, Monica, I'm getting ready to have a new co-host on my Powering Up, which I'd like to mention, which is Erin Allen, who is the co-founder, co-coordinator, manager of the Detroit Podcast Festival, and she has agreed to be a guest host with me. So we're going to do a number of podcasts together pretty soon. And we talked about that in terms of, we want this to be, the style of our podcast is informal. And, Monica, my previous co-host, and my niece, who, was the co-host for a year and a half, she would swear every now and then. And I would leave it in. I would leave it in.
Because that's her.
That's her.
Right.
That's her.
And that's what you want. Oh, I'm so excited about Erin Allen coming aboard. I've known Erin in various different capacities, not only through the Detroit Podcast Festival, but also through other collectives when it came to media creation, media representation. So I was really excited when her name came up, and I think that's going to be a great fit. And I just see great things for the show. So tell us, besides welcoming Erin on as your new co-host, what's next?
She's a guest host for now. She hasn't completely committed herself. I mean, I hope she will. And so she has agreed that, well, we're going to do 3 to 5 episodes and see how this chemistry works. I'm working on her, so put in a good word for me here. But I really believe that, she can help me take this podcast to the next level, and that we can really get into some fantastic conversations that we both bring some very important experience, but different lenses. And she's got a great voice too.
Doesn't she? She's so
Yeah.
relaxing. I love Erin.
Oh, she's got a great voice, and
Yeah,
that's really important, you
that
know?
is
I mean,
important.
there's some people that I'm sorry, I like the topic. I just can't listen to your voice.
I just can't do it.
I can't do it.
Yeah.
Right. And, yeah, I love her voice too.
Yeah, yeah. So what besides welcoming Erin as a guest co-host, what's next for Powering Up? Where do you see Powering Up in the next year?
Well, we've been doing it for a year and a half, as you know, and so we have over 60 episodes out
Mm-hmm.
there, and we want to get a sponsor. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's the next piece. I mean, and I thought that we had to really sort of display some credibility, sort of a track record, start to
Mm-hmm.
build the brand, and before we could go and approach anybody to have a sponsor. And so nobody's going to get rich. I mean, I suppose some people do, but nobody's
Mm-hmm.
going to get rich doing podcasts.
Right.
And so it's really an investment. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, it's a way for me to use my voice to basically bring visibility to
Mm-hmm.
important issues and to wise people whose voices I want heard further. So I would really like, I talk about it being a cross-generational
Mm-hmm.
conversation. I'm a baby boomer, and I really want that perspective of the younger generations.
Mm-hmm.
Very important. I want that conversation. I call it cross-cultural. I
Mm-hmm.
think the fact that she is African American brings a very important experience and voice to the conversations, and I want us to talk. I want us to have courageous conversations. I think there's an incredible need in this country for courageous conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be quite frank about the fact that I'm horrified about where our country is right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that giving voice to wise people who have some smart, important things to say about topics that we really need to talk about is one way that I can help.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly agree with you. And I think that now, especially now, there's a time for courageous conversation and not simply messaging where you're talking at people and then everyone's just shouting back and forth at each other, but a conversation to see, well, why do you feel like that? What do you think about this? Well, how can we come to some sort of agreement, even if it is to say, I understand your viewpoint, I don't agree with it, but where do we go from here?
Yeah, exactly. And I would say in terms of my podcast, and yeah, I can't even listen to the news anymore. I mean, a lot of what's happened
I'm
is
on every
exactly
other
what you're
day.
talking about. Is that right?
I'm on every other. I put my own self on. I watch the news every other day now.
Yeah, yeah, because it's just impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an awful lot of just talking heads yelling at each other. And I'm not interested in my podcast in really doing like a point counterpoint of people who have very, very different opinions about issues. Because there's a lot of people doing that, and I'm not interested in doing that. I don't really want to have people on whose perspective I think is completely wrong.
Yeah.
It's like, nope.
Nope, we're not going to get anywhere.
No. No. The balance to me is thoughtful conversations about complex topics. And so,
Gotcha.
when you bring different perspectives about how do we make progress on these complex, important topics, that's interesting. That's valuable to me. But an argument back and forth about two things, no, I'm not interested in that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is certainly the time. I told everyone, if there was ever a time to become your own media platform, this is the time. When you see these major networks that are using video conferencing to broadcast the news.
There you go.
You have the same type of access. So let's do it. So thank you, Anne, for joining us this evening on our inaugural learning sessions. How can people stay in touch with you and keep up with you?
Okay, well, number one, I want to say thank you, Robin Kinnie, and your Motor City Woman Studio, and now Motor City Woman TV, because it's been fantastic to work with you. I'm so glad that we launched with you, and it's just awesome to work with you. In terms of me, if people are interested, well, there's the Powering Up podcast, which you can listen to anywhere you get your podcasts. I also host this Game Changers podcast, which is on the International Women's Forum, but I put all of those on my Powering Up platform too. My website is annedoyleleadership.com. And if you would like to be part of my global network and hear from me every 6 weeks or so when I send something out to my global network, just contact me through my website and we'll add you.
And I'm just putting this at the bottom here.
Okay.
So you can see.
There you go. AnneDoyleLeadership.com. That's my website.
Right? Yep.
That's it.
And, that's a great way to subscribe to the newsletter so that you're not only seeing, different topics and issues that we all should be aware of, but that's also in where you share, your podcast episodes so people can keep up and listen to it there on your website, in addition to the newsletter subscription.
And of course, there's a Powering Up Women Facebook page.
And the Facebook page.
Yeah, of course.
Powering Up Women on Facebook. I'm going to put that in.
Okay, that would be great. That would be great. I just love how your son was coming up and sort of, showing you stuff. And we're in a whole new world here. Robin just keeps right on broadcasting. Yeah, that's my son who's in the picture.
That's right here.
Showing me stuff. And he's like, oh, yeah, she's just broadcasting again. This is no big deal. I can come up and show her stuff.
I don't care. I was going to say, I was reading, and I don't know if it was a New York Times article or the Atlantic, and they said, moms, stop muting yourselves. You're at home, you have kids, people are going to have to deal with it. Don't try to sterilize your environment.
Ooh, I love it. I love it.
What it is. Now, if it gets unruly, of course, but disruptive. But if you hear him chattering in the background, I've really stopped doing that. I've stopped it.
I think that's amazing. And you know what? I think that's something that's going to come out of this whole isolation period that we've gone through. Is that and I actually listened to a live broadcast from London this morning of the woman who heads up the National Gallery in London, and she was broadcasting from her home, but she was basically making that point about the fact that we've learned that she said the great thing is I've never spent so much time with my family.
Yeah.
And that we've learned a whole new model here of how we can get a lot of great work done, but still be with our family more.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the old models are broken.
It wasn't
working. They deserve to be broken.
Yeah, it wasn't working. And that was really the impetus for me becoming an entrepreneur. I knew I could not have the family life that I wanted. And this happened after my second child. I was like, oh, this isn't working. I see my kids 2 hours a day.
Yeah.
And then they're off to bed.
Yeah. And you're like, no, I don't want either or. And that's what I love about the younger generations of women is that, my generation of women, I mean, it was really a big time either or. And that was what it took to fight some of those early fights to open some doors, but don't stop there. And I love the way younger generations of women are basically saying,
Mm-hmm.
I can do all of this and
Mm-hmm.
I want to enjoy my family.
I want to enjoy my family. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for recognizing that, because he came in and I've been doing these every day. I've been
Yeah,
conducting
no big
interviews
deal
and
to
working.
him.
So he just comes in, he needs the Wi-Fi put back into his tablet or something, and then he walks away. So he's gone now.
Exactly. Right. Right. I just think that's fantastic. Yeah. Now my dogs are not quite as easy to train in that way, and so they're upstairs. They're locked
Yeah, I was
upstairs.
about to say, I haven't heard them. I haven't heard them in a while, actually, in our interviews.
Yeah, because I have a whole new plan for them. They go to the other part of the house upstairs,
Okay.
go take a nap, which they're
Okay.
very happy to do because I have 2 big dogs.
Yeah. I heard them once, but I think that was probably like when this all started. This is like, we're going into month 3. So that was like 2 months ago.
Virtual broadcasting,
Yep.
from home, right, and well, that was probably because they were maybe sleeping in my office, very happily when we started, and then they woke up
They
or
woke up.
started barking or somebody was outside and suddenly they're on duty. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, and I always appreciate you sharing your knowledge, because I just find that when people are that good at something and they've worked at something for so long, and it comes so natural. And that's one of the questions I had was like, well, how is it that Anne could just flow through this very complex conversation? I've seen you navigate some complex conversations and topics and make it relatable and make the guest relatable as well. So that's certainly a skill set that I'm hoping that viewers of this learning session will get from that. So thank you.
You're welcome. My pleasure. My pleasure. I keep learning every single day, and I'll wrap up by saying, I'm the daughter of a broadcaster. My father was a sports broadcaster on television and radio all my life. My mother also taught speech and debate at Indiana University, so I'm from a big family of 7 kids, a bunch of communicators.
About to say, so you had to make your voice heard.
You had to make your voice heard. Yeah, and I remember, I'll never forget one of my friends in, maybe I was 8th grade, 9th grade or something, and one of my friends came over for dinner, and she said, afterwards, she said, "Wow, does your family always fight like that at dinner?" And I said, "We weren't fighting.
Yeah.
We weren't fighting. We were just having a conversation." But, when you have 9 people involved in that conversation, it's, you gotta hold your own.
You have to hold your own. And we will leave it on that note. You have to hold your own, not only in life, but when you're interviewing a guest and in general. So for more about Motor City Woman TV segments, you can check them out on our YouTube channel as well as our website. And to keep up with us, we're at Motor City Woman on all social media platforms. And if you have a show idea, email us hello@motorcitywoman.com. We will see you next time.
Bye. Hasta luego.